Is the world running out of room? There are now round about 7.5 billion of us on this spinning ball in space. The world's resources being stretched as a result. So how long before we push our planet to breaking point? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, we start with a question. What was your commute to work like today? If you live in a big city, the chances are you were stuck in traffic, squashed up in a train carriage with almost now 8 billion people on Earth. What does it mean for us and our planet?
Our population is growing, our resources shrinking. On average, 250 babies are born every minute. That's more than 130 million every year. But with overstretched cities reaching breaking point, are we at risk of running out of room? In 1800, there were about 1 billion people roaming the planet. Today, that figure has exploded to just over 7.5 billion. Half of us live in urban areas, a figure predicted to rise to 66% by 2050. It's expected there will be 2 billion cars on our roads by 2040, and we'll be clocking 20 trillion air travel kilometers in the same period. But cities such as Delhi are choking on fumes. In November of last year, air pollution surged way above hazardous on the Air Quality Index, caused in part by diesel exhaust in the city. In Shanghai, traffic congestion has become so bad, officials are aiming to limit the city's population to 25 million people by 2035. A figure some academics say has already been surpassed. Untamed urbanization by humans is also taking its toll on the natural world. Experts warn that we have destroyed 10% of the world's wilderness in 25 years, crowding some species towards complete extinction. The global average fertility rate is just 2.5 children per woman, but in some parts of the world that figure is much higher. In Niger, women have on average 7 children each, while Chad's fertility rate is around 6.5 children per woman. Past efforts to curb environmental damage have focused on population control in developing nations. In the 1960s, a huge government-sponsored family planning program was rolled out in India, putting controversial sterilization drives at the heart of efforts to combat population growth. In the late 1970s, the Chinese government introduced a raft of population curbing measures, including its controversial one-child policy. But some experts say it's not a case of overpopulation in poorer countries, but of overconsumption in rich ones. The Northern Hemisphere, home to 13 of the 15 largest countries by GDP, emits more greenhouse gas per capita than the Southern Hemisphere. Fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa may be higher, but a person in Niger emits a fraction of the amount of carbon as a person in the United States or the United Kingdom. Some researchers expect the number of people on the planet to reach more than 11 billion by the end of the century, while others say overpopulation is overstated. Is it a question of controlling our growing population, or is it about how we continue to treat our planet?
Joining me at the round table today, well, actually not at the round table, but via Skype in Canberra, Australia, we have the demographer, Dr. Liz Allen. Then we travel across the Atlantic, well, depends which way you go, I suppose, to Vermont in the United States, east coast of the US. Bill Ryerson's there, president of the Population Media Centre, and with me here in the studio we have Alistair Curry, head of campaigns and communications for Population Matters, and Lloyd Msipa, director of Africa Public Policy Research Institute. Thank you from all points of the earth, which I suppose is jolly appropriate considering what we're talking about. And let me come to you first, Liz, if I may, because something you said was that a rising population is not necessarily a disaster. When we've had predictions in the past that the Earth can sustain only somewhere between 4 billion and, okay, 16 billion, we're over the 4 billion now, so why not a disaster?
Look, I think in the current population discourse that we see across the world is this idea that we're in a catastrophic situation, and any kind of population increase will only increase our problem moving forward in terms of pressures on natural resources, food production will be a problem, and the like. But it's not a catastrophe. That said, population is not homogeneously dispersed across the globe, and we see some areas experiencing most definitely issues with food scarcity and issues around insecurity when it comes to the natural resources. But overall, the population isn't in catastrophic condition.
No, but we're pretty overstretched, aren't we?
See, here's the thing. A lot of people, when we're talking about population, they look around themselves and they focus on their experiences day to day. That might be their commute to work, or to travelling to education, or trying to get their child enrolled in school. What you're seeing around you is not an issue with population per se, but rather an issue with an infrastructure failure.
Okay, so
and that's
I
something
think
we
one
should
of the
be
things,
mindful of.
Yeah, one of the things you might be suggesting, everybody else can jump in at this point, is that we don't prioritise correctly. You know, you have areas where there are a lot of people and they don't necessarily have enough food, they don't have enough resources, that people are greedy to some extent, and they don't understand that they need to sort of share things around a bit more evenly.
I think we have to look at the global picture. And when you look at what's happened in population doubled in the last 50 years, you can map, indeed, over the last 100 years, you can map our growth in population against all sorts of indicators of environmental problems, be that soil erosion, extinctions, climate change, which is obviously the big one, freshwater use. So when you look at the two curves of population growth and these indicators, you're looking at a problem. Whether or not it's catastrophic is a matter of interpretation, but what you're looking at is an area in which, if we put more carbon emitters on the planet, if we put more people who require food, if we put more people who require water on the planet, we are putting pressure. And in fact, the Earth's renewable resources are currently estimated that we're using 1.7 Earth's worth of renewable resources.
I did read that.
Of course, there are more things we can do to cut our consumption, to cut our impact technologically and in the way that we behave. But fundamentally, when you're adding more people, and the more people you add, the more difficult it is to solve those problems. That's the
I'm going to come to you, I promise you.
All right, okay.
But I'm going to go to Bill first, because he's sitting quietly there on the East Coast of the United States, and he's got up jolly early for us. What do you make of what you've heard so far? That perhaps we're being irresponsible, perhaps we don't understand the problem correctly, that it isn't necessarily a question of overpopulation, it's a question of managing your resources?
I'm going to try to create a bridge between Liz and Alistair. So we do have two demographic worlds. We have Europe and Japan and Russia with very low fertility rates. And we have sub-Saharan Africa and some South Asian countries with very high fertility rates. And we have some in between. But indeed, the very high fertility rate countries have not been changing their growth trajectory very rapidly. Some have, but most have not, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So indeed, when you look at economic development since World War II, every country that has gone from developing to developed status since World War II started by reducing fertility rate. And they then achieved what's called the demographic dividend, which Liz referred to, which is basically, to give a very quick explanation, when, without any change in family income, people have fewer children, they are spending less of their annual or monthly income on food, housing, and clothing, and they have some money left over. That goes into bank savings accounts, that creates capital in the marketplace, that allows businesses to borrow and expand, that leads to rising demand for employees, which drives up wages, and at the same time, over time, the number of people trying to find jobs is starting to slow down.
Are you suggesting that population control is not necessarily down to simply birth control, but it's down to sort of education, showing people that they could be better off if they didn't have quite so many children, and then that would bring the different rates of growth and different rates of disparity closer together?
Indeed, if people had an understanding of both the health and the economic benefits of smaller family size and delaying childbearing until adulthood, they would then be able to achieve the demographic dividend that is missing in so many countries with very high fertility rates now.
Okay, Bill, thanks. Lloyd, you've been very, very patient.
Yes,
Thank you. Say what you want to say, and then I've got a question for you.
Thank you. I want to come in on the back end of what Bill says there. When you look at a country or countries going through a high population growth or high birth rate, it's a sign that something else is wrong, or there's another driving force to that. Look at Britain, for instance, post-World War, the replacement of all the people who lost their lives after World War II. See, that was the driving force. These are the baby boomers that we see aging now. Go back to sub-Saharan Africa. When we see a family of 7, it's not because they want to be 7. It's because the idea is to have as many children as possible, so that if 4 survive or 3 survive, the family is pretty much intact.
Yeah.
And let's also look at the population narrative in the context of other indicators that we should, an African country, for example, let's say South Africa. South Africa is now stabilized, but at some point during the apartheid era, you go into Soweto, go into Alexander, the growth rate, population birth rate was very high. But as people become more educated, they've got access to better paying jobs, that has stabilized. Go next door to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's birth rate has been very high, despite all the diseases, HIV and so on. It is a survival mechanism. It's a human thing. Nature on its own stands to, life finds a way. Remember, what was that movie, the dinosaur movie?
Jurassic.
Yes, life finds a way of self-balance. So at some point...
Which is almost a Malthusian argument, isn't it? But
exactly.
Can I go to Liz?
Yeah.
Can I go to Liz?
Yes.
Because we're talking, let's say here, about sub-Saharan Africa. And that brings to mind the disparities in age demographics. Because in the big cities in that part of the world, you're going to find there's a very, very high number of young people. Whereas in the developed countries that have big populations, you're going to find an awful lot of old cronies like me. So how does that balance up when it comes to overpopulation?
And this is quite interesting. On one hand, we've got an ageing population in quite a substantial part of the world where fertility is below replacement. So populations aren't replacing themselves. But on the other hand, we've got populations that have quite high fertility and as a result are quite young. Now, at the same time, we've got this kind of juggling act occurring where we've got the likes of Australia, US, the UK, who are ageing in a way and requiring essential employment in terms of a taxpayer base to contribute to the government coffers to support an ageing population. Now, on one hand, it's quite beneficial that we have this kind of two-speed global population situation where some countries can benefit from migrating to areas that are in dire need in some cases for skills and labour. Now, this raises a few questions too about fairness.
Can we come back with some of those in just a moment?
Certainly.
If we can, because I'm trying to bounce this around. And Alistair, I know you wanted to say something in response to what Liz is saying, and then I'll go to you, Bill.
I think we've got to be careful when we talk about population in terms of thinking only about places where we're seeing very high population growth, and that is sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. This is also about impact. You look at the country with the highest fertility rate in the world is Niger, which has got a fertility rate of over 7. But a single person from Niger will produce 160th of the carbon emissions of someone from the US, or a 65th of the carbon emissions from someone from the UK. So if you look at impact, in fact, having a smaller population, having fewer Americans being born or fewer Brits being born is actually, in terms of addressing climate change, which is, many believe, an existential threat to us, actually small families here. So we've got, when we talk about it, we shouldn't just be obsessed with the simple numbers. And the other issue, I think, which comes about talking about aging and that transition, which certainly is a challenge that we face, is, first of all, having an aging population is much less of a problem than having your atmosphere burn up. And secondly, it's about the choices that we make about, do we need more people to deliver a higher tax base, or do those of us who are already here need to pay more taxes? There are other solutions to the problem.
Okay, you talk about the US and the carbon footprint,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. How does this one work out? In a developing country with a massive population, I'm thinking of India, which is an industrializing society and has a massive carbon footprint per head of population. That's the perfect storm for things going wrong, isn't it?
It is. Well, actually, I mean, India at the moment has a pretty small carbon footprint per head of population, but that's exactly what we're talking about. One of the
But
things,
it's going up. It's going up.
It's
and they
going
say,
up.
well, why shouldn't we be allowed to?
And absolutely, people have a right to move out of poverty.
Yeah.
People have a right to economic development. But when that economic development takes place, they will be consuming more and having a greater impact. Of course, those of us who are already consuming more and having an impact need to look at our family size, but we can't be complacent.
And everybody wants
no, absolutely. Bill, jump in. You're the bridge builder.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to consume more. So some people say, well, rapid population growth in developing countries isn't a problem because they have small carbon footprints. But in fact, they all want to increase their carbon footprint. Everybody wants to live higher on the hog, and therefore we need to look at the fact that both overconsumption in Western countries and rapid growth in numbers of people times rapid growth in rates of consumption per capita in developing countries are both contributing to what is an unsustainable situation. And climate change and loss of biodiversity are just two examples of why we are not living sustainably now.
But the difficulty here, as I see it, and any one of you jump in at this point, is it's very hard to tell people in India that you can't consume as much as those rich people in other countries.
It's the same thing.
And it's the same
thing in Africa, because for Africa to come out of poverty, it has to industrialize. Yes, the bad side to it is that you're going to have the carbon footprint going up. But industrialization is the major step to get those African countries out of poverty. And when they're out of poverty, you find that the narrative of overpopulation takes a back seat, because everybody tends to tie poverty in Africa to overpopulation, which is not necessarily true, because there are other indicators that people should be looking at. For example, intrusive policies from first world countries, in terms of dictating economic trajectories those countries should take. So it is important to look at this holistically, from a governance point of view and from a economic point of view. Yeah.
Well, you have to look at it holistically, in a global, from a global point of view. And what you have to say is, let's all be very sensible about this. Let's share our wealth around, so everybody's got exactly the same amount. And let's all move around a little bit out of the big cities in the country, so we've all got enough room. And let's be sensible about the size of the families that we're all going to have, and then we can all possibly live in harmony. But that's not going to happen. So what are the scenarios? Is there a way of turning it around, Alistair, or are we facing doomsday eventually?
We're not facing doomsday eventually. We are looking to, I mean, it is inevitable that our population is going to rise to at least 10 million and probably more. But if you actually look at
10 billion.
10 billion, yeah, sorry. And the current UN projection for 2100 is around about 11 billion. But if you actually look at the difference on that projection, if on average there was half a child more per family, we're actually looking at a population in 2100 of 16 billion. If there was half a child less than the UN projects in the middle, we're looking at a population of 7.3 billion. Those aren't massive changes, and yet the difference in terms of the impact on our planet, the resources that we consume, is enormous. And that is a solvable problem, which I'm sure we'll go
Okay, the UN population assessment projects the world population will plateau by 2050 and will remain stable until 2300. Therefore, perhaps there's not a problem.
That's exactly my point. At some point, it will level out, because as the poor countries come out of poverty, there's now an understanding that they can actually have 2 children, and those children will survive, as opposed to a situation where you have to have 10, and out of the 10, if 2 survive, that is what the scenario is now. And we industrialize, people become more educated, the population will stabilize. And the demographic, it's a transition thing. It won't happen. In the UK, for instance, it went through from high birth rate to stabilized, and now you've got an aging population. Same thing in South Africa, same thing in Bangladesh. And other African countries are going through the same thing. So it will plateau.
So you think by what was the year? 2050?
I
Plateauing.
think,
You think that
the world population will not exceed a certain number.
Okay, the world population will not exceed a certain number, so says the United Nations, for, I think it's a period of a couple of 100 years. But is that because we're going to see what some might refer to as the Malthusian factor, that because we're overpopulated, we're going to see natural disasters overtake those huge population numbers and cut them back, if you like, in quotes, naturally?
Look, there's a big problem with the so-called Malthusian or neo-Malthusian way of thinking, and that is that the assumptions are based on that our technological development will remain steady and we won't innovate. And we've shown and we've proven over time that our food production, with the aid of technology, the way that we do things in the home with the aid of technology and the like, means that we can improve our lifestyle, we can improve our well-being.
Yeah, okay.
So this idea that we're all going to...
No, I mean, I think the problem is that's relying on, when we're in a situation in which we're in what's called the sixth mass extinction at the moment, where our temperature is almost certainly going up by 1.5, may go at 3 degrees. We're working on the hope that we're going to find some solution to that problem. What we know is if we reduce the number of carbon emitters, if we reduce the number of consumers, if we reduce the number of people requiring...
But this is right to a certain extent. Necessity is the mother of invention, and we've always found our way out of...
That's right.
And I think that what we need to be wise about is looking at what else we can do.
We're going to go to Bill because he's a very polite man. He's not jumping in. He's not butting in. But you want to say something?
Yes, I'm not such an optimist that I think necessity always leads to invention, because we've seen a lot of people die of starvation already. We also have seen in countries where infant and child mortality rate has been dramatically reduced, which is most of the countries of the world, where 7 children may be born in a family in Niger and 6.5 of them survive to adulthood. It's not automatic that desired family size drops down to 2. So what's clear in what everybody has said is the pressure on the environment and the pressure on people's economic welfare is such that the world would be better off if people reduced fertility rate. And doing so requires stopping child marriage, requires allowing women to have an education, allowing them to make their own decisions about reproduction, promoting smaller family norms, and various other steps that improve the welfare of women and children that will lead to lower fertility rates. So it's a human rights-based solution that is available to us.
Yeah.
It's not just a provision of family planning services, although those are critically important.
Population control should not be intrusive. You know, like what Bill is suggesting, that we go on some kind of birth control siege in
I'm not suggesting
countries.
birth control.
Population control.
I'm suggesting human rights.
Oh, okay. Population control should happen as a natural progression from poverty to prosperity. And as we move and as we encourage those countries that have the high death rate, the high fertility, the sort of high mortality rate in terms of children, improve their economies, improve their well-being, their education, you find that the population issue is something that won't come to to the fore. People will be now more concerned about their lifestyles, how they improve their lot. As things stand now, we have certain countries putting intrusive policies to those very same poor countries that they are meant to help. And that keeps them in perpetual mode.
I'm going to have to wind you up. I'm going to have to wind you up, Lloyd. And I don't mean to be patronising.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
But we do have the end of the programme coming up. Are we going to be able to keep home on earth?
I'm optimistic that we will, but only if we take action at this point. It needs action across population, family size, consumption habits, technology, all these things. They're all things within our gift. They're all things that we can do. But the question is whether or not we're going to be smart enough and sharp enough.
And Liz, are we all going to have to move to Australia because you've got lots of room?
Look, and here's the thing. The planet that we know at the moment will endure. The difficulty is that we must innovate and we must shift our minds and consider that indeed population's not the problem here. It's policy and funding and infrastructure. If we want to see ourselves endure on this planet, we must get ourselves out of this old, outdated notion of applying particular policies that have been tried and tested 50 years in the past and consider them into the future. Let's move with the times. Let's consider how we can adjust our behaviour rather than apply restrictive policies that control human rights in a way that I think is not expected by these people that say we need to go in and give people, women in particular, the gift of small families. I think we've gone the opposite way of restriction.
Liz, thank you very much indeed. Night time in Australia. Bill, thank you very much indeed. Very early morning on the east coast of the United States, and to my guests here. I think the general feeling happens to be that as long as we take care of our planet, take care of ourselves, and think about our fellow man, our fellow woman, then there is hope even as population numbers do go up. It's just that one or two things have got to change if we're to make it as comfortable as we would like it to be, this place we call home. Thank you all very much for joining me. Thank you for watching. You can find us on YouTube. Hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, and the team. Goodbye for now.